Today we are going to consider the way the kingdom of God advances and the fundamental difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of the earth. The governments, the countries of the earth operate on a very human and earthly level. And if they want to assert their authority, what they do is to force people. First of all, they create laws that tell you what is lawful and what is not. Then, if you disobey the law, you are arrested, you are questioned, you are possibly judged, possibly condemned, possibly incarcerated, jailed. And sometimes they operate different ways around that frame. For example, during the COVID, the governments operated a variety of systems created to make sure that the disease didn't spread. The most drastic one was the Chinese one, where visited houses had to surrender their sick. Anyone that was found to have the disease was forcibly ejected and sent to hospital. And people were forced to stay indoors. In France, it was less drastic but still very serious. You couldn't get out of your house without a special paper. And if you were arrested, stopped outside your house, you had to show that paper. If you didn't have that permission that allowed you to go onto a limited territory, I think it was 5 kilometers, you were stopped and sent back home. Even in restaurants, people were stopped and they had to show their permit. Here in the UK, the government issued less stringent but still, although flexible, but nevertheless serious warnings. For example, you couldn't go from one county to the next. Normally, nobody was checking, so it was easier to operate. So that's the way it is done. Now, if you are forced to do something, normally the result is that you want to do it. That's human nature. Disobedience is in our blood by birth. That's what Christians call the original sin. So from infancy, you like disobedience. And normally adults do disobey. People continue driving even though the street lights in front of them are on the red. They don't mind. Many people ignore the stops on a roundabout. There are so many things that happen, and yes, it is causing accidents, it's causing killing sometimes, but people still do it. And every day we arrest thieves, murderers, and the rest. So people try to enforce what they assume to be good from the outside, with laws, with the police, with arrest, and it has never been perfect, because although a number of people respect the law, there are inevitably a good number that don't. Now what the government of God does is the radical opposite. And I give you the example of slavery. There's one interesting letter in the New Testament that is called the letter to Philémon. Paul was in prison and he was writing to Philémon, that was a rich, wealthy Christian. That man had a lot of slaves because at the time slavery was everywhere. So people possessed slaves. And God has already given laws that were saying that you can have a slave, but after a while you have to release that slave and he has to go free. He doesn't need to do anything for it. And this is written in several books of the Old Testament, in particular Deuteronome and Leviticus. And also, if you study the words for slave, the one that has been translated slaves in English translations, there are different translations. There are different words that were used. But the same word was eved, meant servant, bond servant, slave, worker, companion, delegate, and ambassador. So that is quite a wide range. And that word, eved, had always been translated with one of the words that I just listed. So there was provision on how to do with slaves, how to behave with slaves in the Old Testament. In Israel, you couldn't be a slave forever, unless by choice. But then, in the letter to Philémon, Paul reports that one of the runaway slaves of Philémon had come to him. He met him, and that man, Onesimus, had become a Christian. And then he was brought to Paul, and he had become one of the helpers to Paul, one of the collaborators. But Paul knew that Onesimus was a former slave, and he had run away, so he was not released by Philémon. So he writes to Philémon and said, look now, your runaway slave has come here in Rome, and he is now with me, he's working with me, and he's not only my brother but my spiritual son. But because he left you in an illegal manner, I'm sending him back, and I want you to treat him like my son, like me. We are now family. And his letter was obviously received. And this is the way things were happening in the first century after Christ. Slaves and their masters were attending church together. And it is written in several places, you cannot be a slave or a master anymore. We are all brothers and sisters. And so it obviously changes the relationship you have with the person. And that is completely independent from laws and enforcement. So what has changed now is that from the heart, there has been a total change. And slavery has been defeated, because slavery cannot stay within a family. And I know you will tell me, oh, well, but what about the colonizers of Africa that took people and enslaved them? Now, even though these bodies, these nations, these groups of slavers were saying they were Christians, I tell you they were not. Now, what is a Christian? A Christian is somebody that is a disciple of Christ, somebody that has given his or her life to Christ and that is now bent, consecrated to do everything and to say everything the way Jesus would have done. And Jesus never treated anyone as slave. He went to all kinds of people, the outcast, the women, the ones that were called guilty or dirty or whatever. And so no real Christian can enslave anyone or treat someone like a slave. And that is a challenge. This is the superiority of the kingdom of God over every kingdom, every government of the earth.